Welcome to Qualitative Data class. Instructor today is Zachary, and we hope you enjoy the class. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to class. I'm Drew. We have a slowly growing crowd in the room and a bunch of people on the webinar, so thank you for joining today. So to start, some of you may have been to Commerce Data Academy courses before, but just as a reminder, this is an initiative launched by the Commerce Data Service. We offer a lot of topics, and all of that is available at dataacademy.commerce.gov. You can also email us with questions at dataacademy@doc.gov. But someone just asked a question in the room if this is a new class for us, and I think this is the first time that we taught something like this, so I'm really looking forward to having everyone involved today, and hopefully you will get a lot of concrete skills out of it. Just some quick guidelines and ground rules. Feel free to ask questions at any time, whether through WebEx or in person. This is really supposed to be a participatory class. Definitely relies on everyone's active participation, so please ask questions whenever you would like. Online participants, we sent out the designated partner assignments for you. We'll have 5 or 6 practice exercises, so make sure that you have reached out to those people and you know how to get in touch with each other when the time comes to actually start talking to people. And then finally, if any of the topics that we cover today are of interest, if you want to dig in on anything more, if you want to share any of these topics with your office or your team, our design team at the Commerce Data Service can come to your bureaus if you have an MOU with us. So feel free to ask me or Radhika about that, and we can come in and work with you, teach a workshop to dig in and share these skills more with anyone from your team. Since we started just a few minutes late while people were joining, let's just dive in. The first thing that I wanted to ask, as I pose questions, please feel free to chime in from online through the chat feature, and obviously in person. So I wanted to ask, first of all, what brings you here? What was your interest in this topic, and how are you thinking about how you might use it? That's super helpful. So sorry, can people on the WebEx hear without a mic when people are participating? Okay. So yeah, tips and tricks for focus groups, interviewing, collecting qualitative feedback. Anything else in particular that brought you guys here? Awesome. I think that's actually a really common story, especially with qualitative, is that people can tend to sort of throw it in, and there is definitely a lot of science to it. We scientists use it all the time. So that's a lot of what we'll cover today, is really how to be rigorous and how to have some really concrete skills that you can apply collecting and analyzing qualitative data. Great. So we have a couple more online.
People online said, I'm interested in learning the state of the art research. Yes. I predict using some information here to help with stakeholder reviews in project management.
I'll cover all of that as well. So yeah, with that in mind, what we'll cover today is 4 questions. So I think, to take a step back, I definitely want everyone to walk away from this class with really concrete skills in stable methods of qualitative data collection, in particular in-depth interviews, but also focus groups and a few different types of observation, which is sort of like the core, to know exactly what those are, when is best to use them, and really like a step-by-step guide of how to collect that data rigorously. In order to sort of situate that in the type of questions that really help you to get the most out of qualitative data, we'll start by talking about how you form the right kinds of questions, recognize situations much more broadly than hopefully you're starting from, in terms of where qualitative data could actually help you and provide really useful insights. And then we'll dig into logistics and all of these different data collection methods. The thing I want to say from the top is that we're not really going to dig too much into specific analysis methods. But again, I will point you to a lot of resources for analyzing qualitative data, and we can follow up if you're interested in doing more on that. Definitely reach out and we can talk more about that. Before we dive in, I want to just say that I think, as a lot of people probably know, qualitative research, much like quantitative research, is an enormous domain. It encompasses a ton of different methodologies, everything from ethnography to case studies to cognitive domain analysis, tons of data collection methods, and tons of data types and analysis approaches. So we're not going to try to map the universe today. We're going to dig into sort of a smaller subset, and it's going to be bounded by thinking how we can use qualitative data to inform design. I mean that really broadly. So this could be design of systems, environments, websites, technologies, physical devices, products, even policies and programs, like a training program, for example, a data collection form even, or a reporting template, anything that requires design in some way. We'll talk about how you can use qualitative data at any step of the process to help improve that in terms of asking the right questions, engaging stakeholders, knowing sort of what methods to apply. And then again, we're going to spend a solid hour on in-depth interviewing and getting a lot of practice and really applying specific question types, probing types, techniques, and skills to really get extremely high quality qualitative data. And these are super transferable, not just to other data collection methods, but to your life in general. So hopefully by focusing on in-depth interviewing in particular, you'll be able to apply a lot of those techniques to any other form of qualitative data collection as well. Okay, question for everyone. The thing that you can probably, you probably know something about just from being a human in the world, but what is qualitative data? What do you think of when you hear qualitative data? Word. Subjectivity, ouch. Subject quality. What else? Is anyone on this? Okay. No, that's a good one. Objective information. That's awesome, yeah. Can you mean by narrative? Stories. Cool. So yes, that's all right. I'll put a pin in subjectivity and come back to that. But yes, so those are all true. Qualitative data is obviously, numeric data, not numbers, but words, stories, images, sketches, audio and video recordings, photographs, maps. We'll talk about artifacts and what that means. All of those things are qualitative data. And because people like definitions, there is a definition that you are welcome to use of what qualitative data collection is. But some of the things that I'll just point out are that it really focuses on we're not estimating parameters. We're not testing hypotheses in a quantitative sense. Really, the purpose of qualitative data collection is to be able to better understand, document content, structure, either in some cases where you have unknown baseline information, where it's exploratory. In some cases where, you have a quantitative finding and you have no idea what your quantitative finding means. You don't know how a process works or why, or you want to understand how context plays a role. So these are all important characteristics of qualitative data collection. So, a lot of questions today, so I hope everyone is really excited to share their perspectives. So, why, having that more information on what qualitative data collection is, why is that important to your work or to technology and policy design in general? Reaching audience effectively? Definitely. Incorporating multiple visions and perspectives. Understanding what those perspectives are in the first place.
Line said, users are not numbers.
Yeah.
That's really good.
That's great.
And if we understand end users better, we can design better tech/policy.
Yeah,
so,
that's awesome. That's great. So I'm going to use that to jump into the next point, which is those are true. And there are a lot of reasons that it's really important to have that kind of descriptive, qualitative information when we're designing anything, but especially something that's supposed to be used by another human being, including policy. So we taught increasingly about human-centered policy, human-centered design. And the point being, we value deliver service to our stakeholders, to members of the public, in a way that has their needs, interests at the heart of how the thing is constructed. So we want to do things that have our human constituents, the American people, at the center of the how, what, and why of what we're doing. So the visuals that are on this slide show some things you might recognize if you took our UX class. But the sort of point of them is that they still work, but they're very inconveniently designed. And observe that by looking at them. If you had to describe that to someone, you might say, well, there's a door there, it's fine. A door and there's stairs. But when you actually talk to a human being who's trying to walk out of that door or walk up the stairs or open that door and use it for something in particular, you'd have more information about exactly what's wrong with it and how it got that way in the first place, or how it was supposed to work, if there was a goal in mind, or the specific ways that people are having trouble using it, and, soliciting some kind of data on how we can improve it. So everything we do has human stakeholders, and to be human-centered, we need to talk to them. I want to think of a few specific examples just to make that a little bit more concrete in terms of specific ways, specific goals that you might have where qualitative data could come into play. So, for example, the first one, so or like WebEx, when you're in a room by yourself, has a lot of experts in their organization who have really, really technical expertise. And sometimes these people have expertise that no one else understands at all. It's sort of just that one person who knows the thing. Yeah. So this is a really sort of niche but really critical way that qualitative data can become really important. Niching expertise is sort of this whole field within qualitative data collection. And the point of that is, so say you have a really technical sort of role in your organization and you're going through a period of transition. Either that person is leaving or you're trying to expand their office or going through a political transition. Being able to document everything that's in that person's head, how they go about their work, what their flow is like, why it is that way, how it got that way, capturing that kind of institutional knowledge and technical knowledge out of the work that they just do in their head. Really the only way to get that is through talking to them and interacting with them and asking them to explain the tasks that they do in a really kind of structured way. So that's one example of ways that qualitative data can help you to meet your organization's needs. understanding how experts think about a decision or make a decision, modeling their processes, which can even feed into quantitative models. So if you, as we all do at Commerce Learning, have a ton of data and you want to expand the reach of your data, you want new stakeholders to use it and have a better way to access it, sort of increasingly common problem. A lot of people have sort of mentioned or alluded to so far just user experience and user interface design, whether it's a visual design or a process design or redesign, is that people use your website or your data portal or your API or whatever the case may be. That involves interacting with human beings to understand their needs and how they're currently going through a process. Really importantly, why people aren't using something. So it's not just about talking to your users, it's about understanding if they aren't using your system or your tool and they're accomplishing a task, they're doing it some other way. It's really important to be able to understand why they're doing it that way and how they're doing it and how it can inform the design of the service you deliver. And then so lastly, we similarly want to make our products and our policies more driven by external stakeholders than sometimes things that are just driven by how we've always done it. Really, no one knows why we do it that way. It just happens to be done that way. And so quality data can help you sort of understand those root causes and the underlying problems and even unintended consequences. So before we, I think, get into an exercise, I just want to point out with user feedback, and that is super important. It's a really critical way that qualitative data is useful, but there's so much more to it than that. There's so many other kinds of data that you can collect that are really useful in your work. So think about non-users, think about internal stakeholders, think about environments that you can observe, people who are members of the public who you currently don't interact with. What can you learn from them? And consider all of those different approaches. And then sort of practice forming some of these questions, and as you get into interviewing people today, keep in mind that human behavior is complicated, and it's sometimes more complicated than just asking someone what you want to know. Sometimes you need to sort of take a step back and build a bigger picture of what kind of environment that person's operating in. So I'll give you an example. If you were, this is actually an example that will sort of carry through the class today, but you're trying to design a healthier supermarket. So whatever that might mean. Maybe you're trying to design a supermarket where everybody buys healthy food all the time. Changing the supermarket. And you were able to speak with people to figure out how to do that. So maybe start by speaking to the people who shop at the supermarket. You could ask them, how can we make the supermarket healthier? And things, they'll get an answer. But they might tell you something like, oh, no, take the chip aisle out of the supermarket or something. Or they might say, it's healthy as it is. It's fine. But if you really start to build a picture of, okay, well, how does that person decisions about what they buy? Who are they trying to feed? How many do they have? Where are they coming from? If you sort of start to paint that bigger picture of their goals, their needs, constraints that they have, and problem space they're operating in, what physical space do they have to do this? What does the supermarket look like now? What digital space do they have? Do they have Instacart? Do they have some other food delivery that they could use? Do they even buy groceries that often? That will really help you to have a richer data set. And when we talk about data quality and subjectivity, the thing that makes qualitative data very high quality is having that really thick description and having a really contextually rich picture of the person's, all of these things, goals, constraints, problems, environment, not just getting the sliver of information that you think you're looking for. Okay, so any questions on any of that before we start with an exercise? Cool. Any questions online right now? Okay. So for the people who are on WebEx, You're welcome to do this by yourself or to give your partners a call and talk through it. It's totally up to you. In the room, maybe we can just like do pairs or groups of a pair and a group of 3. Well, I want you guys to think about identifying 3 challenges or problems in your current work where you think that qualitative data could help you to address the issue, and try to formulate some questions that you could answer with qualitative data that are really practical to your work. And remember to think in terms of how and why, context, process, gaining multiple perspectives. So take a few minutes and brainstorm about that. Try to come up with 3, and then we'll come back together and discuss. And wrap up. So, what's what you guys came up with? I heard some really interesting things. So,
the program that came online for ITA, and it's pretty much for the travel program. And we're having difficulty with is people actually using the program, submit all the required documentations and stuff, that when they travel for their safety, for their well-being, for travel, it's cost efficient, and any other requirements we have per the guidelines and stuff. Just get everybody to submit all the stuff at once. So it's a policy issue, but people just don't know the whole policy. So how do we advertise it, make it broader, and easy for them to actually apply to it?
Yeah, that's a really great one.
Yeah.
Like, one of the things that we'll talk about is whenever you implement a change to something, people get really, obviously the issue of like how you design the thing. Is it like optimized for how people are trying to use it? But then there's also like people get really ingrained in how they do things. We're creatures of habit, and if you want to change the way people do things, there's a lot, that goes into how do you articulate it to them, how do you explain it to them in a way that actually, works it in with how they do things, and that's a really good use for qualitative data.
Resource allocation is always a huge priority in terms of training. Allocating funds to the right area, to the right people. The quality of information from our workforce, and we're asking the right questions, and making sure we're actually dealing with that information is a challenge.
Yeah, that's a great one. That's a great one too.
Is improving geographic standards, that people have different interpretations of how features should be laid out and how they should be coded electronically, and trying to gather all those ideas and come up with unified standards that everyone can follow.
Yeah, great example. Just in terms of one of the things that we'll talk about is qualitative data helps you understand how things are organized in people's minds. Really, really important, because if your user is trying to access geographic data or just different data points, and the way you've organized them in your mapping tool have like no relationship to how they're actually organized and the way a user thinks about them. It's really complicated for people to actually like do anything practical with the information. A few from the chat, I think. Understand the invention of the applicant. How are families inconvenienced when the lactation room gets locked overnight starting at 4:15 p.m.? Specific, that's a question. Do people feel when the computers break down for heavy use on alternate Mondays? Use/survey techniques resulting in a lack of data. Yeah, this is great. Okay, cool. So lots of different, I think good to see that people are thinking about lots of different kinds and sources of qualitative information. So that's great. So we're gonna, before we, the sort of last building block before we actually get into you have a human being in front of you, how you interview them well, is how to actually go about sampling. And that's a really important piece of data quality. So really fast hacks. First of all, I just wanted to give you guys this sort of crib sheet of tools of the trade. What does actually look like what do you do with your time when you're collecting qualitative data? And the basic categories, though there are of course more, are talking to people, observing people, and task-based or structured methods. So basically that means asking someone to complete a task and generating data that way. So we'll dig into, again, interviews, focus groups, observation, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those task-based methods, especially because I think they'll be really useful to some of the issues that you guys have brought up. Who to interview or who to observe? This is a really important question. So the first thing that I emphasize is now you kind of have a very kind of broad picture of the different approaches. Try to inform, try to let what you do and who you look for be informed by what information you actually want to know. So like, don't necessarily assume that you just need to talk to people who use the product or talk to people who are mothers who work in your office. Really about what's the problem and what you need to know, who has that information. So again, that could be non-users. It could be the people who are the janitor staff. It could be people who designed the way things are now. But really let people who have that information drive, how you're sampling, who has the expertise that you need. So in terms of sampling, I think people are probably the most familiar with the kind of random sampling that we do in quantitative research, in statistical research in particular, that really looks at random sampling as the gold standard. So it is different with qualitative data. And one of the has anyone ever heard the term purposive sampling? Except in qualitative research that relies on a biased sample. The point there, so I take a step back. There's an image on the screen. Does anyone know what that is? Okay, we've got carburetor, outdoor shopping mall. I found it looks like a tape measure with like a lot of stuff in it that maybe was like went through a garbage disposal. Carburetor. So we have her in the room. So the reason I use this example is because if I genuinely don't know what a carburetor is, and I think that there might be other people who also don't know, I really don't know how it works. So if I want to know how a carburetor works, and I did a random sample of people in the United States, ask them to explain to me how a carburetor works, I think that would go. Not well. Probably well. There's a lot of people who don't know what it is, or tell you something wrong, or just don't know how it works at all. This would be a great way to know the distribution of knowledge about carburetors in the population. If that's what you wanted to know, you should totally do a random sample. But if you want someone to explain to you how it works, you're going to ask people who know a lot about carburetors. So you start with auto mechanic or someone who you know personally who's really into cars, someone who's fixed your car before. You're going to people who are disproportionately likely to know about that thing. And that's sort of the point in qualitative sampling is the sample is biased. The point is that it's biased. You want to seek out people who have the information you need. So that's sort of purpose of sampling, to look to the people who have the information that you need. And rather than gathering a small volume of data from a ton of people, you're gathering a large volume of data from a much smaller number of very carefully selected people. So that's not to say that you can't use random sampling, because that actually can work. But you just want to be sure that you're randomly sampling from a frame of people who all have the information that you need. There's no reason that you can't do that. It's just necessary, and it's really not particularly helpful because typically you're looking at a sample size where it's going to mean anything to have done a random sample. Typically less than 50 people, for example. And importantly, we're not estimating parameters, so it doesn't really matter if you have a random sample or not. So how is enough? Anyone ever heard the term saturation? Anybody? Okay. So this is another area where quantitative research has zero, because you basically have, an equation that will tell you how many you need to be confident in the validity of your results. Not so with qualitative. There are rules of thumb that you can go by, but the concept that we're looking for is that as you continue to elicit information from individuals, there will be a point when basically you stop getting new information. You start to hear the same things over and over, you start to hear themes, and there isn't new information that's emerging to help you develop new understanding and new themes. And that's the point that we call saturation. It is squishier than some quantitative researchers are comfortable with, but in practice, you will absolutely observe it. It's really not hard to tell. You get to a point where you're hearing the same things over and over and over. And in terms of concrete numbers, that does depend a lot on what you're trying to learn. How many dimensions of variability you're introducing? Are you talking to people across the country or just in Washington, D.C.? Do you want to talk to single parents and people with very large households? Do you want to talk to people who are users and who are non-users? So as you introduce variability, you need to talk to more people. But a typical rule of thumb is 4 focus groups and about 30 in-depth interviews per site or per population. You look in really rigorous research literature, the recent studies that are coming out, that's the kind of sample size that you would tend to see. To another example, if you heard a research article where someone said they did 90 focus groups, laugh to yourself that that's a very silly thing to do, because 90 is a completely ridiculous number of focus groups to do. Obviously, if you're trying to collect data about the entire world, you would want to do a lot of data collection, but in general, think about smaller sample sizes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The same concerns. If you talk to 5, so in quantitative research, when we talk about internal and external validity, in qualitative research, we talk about reliability, really. So if you only spoke to 5, question, can I articulate Laura's question? So how do we, do you want to make a question?
Asking was epically reverberating. I was asking a question of, we have the concept of bias in quantitative research. So if you don't random sample, or you don't meet the law of large numbers or what have you, you have these bias that the results you get are not going to be representative or I'm wondering if there was a similar concept in qualitative data that if you don't meet that threshold of 30 interviews or 4 focus groups, what are the risks to a smaller sample?
Yeah. So Yes, there absolutely is a similar concept, and you'd worry about similar things. So in terms of internal and external validity, which are sort of like the two things that we think about in any research paradigm, we know, start with yours, which I think is more about external validity. So if you interview or survey X number of people, how confident are you that you're capturing what exists in the population and not in your sample? So if you were to do 5 interviews, people would tend to have a very similar concern that you only did 5 interviews. That's not really enough to capture what's an artifact of those 5 people versus what exists in the whole population. I can refer everyone to some articles that are just really like kind of brief nuggets of excellence about how to do that for qualitative. But yes, it's about stating how you found the people, the data quality, and the number. So, you know, for instance, on how people of, you know, particular socioeconomic status buy groceries in Baltimore, Maryland. If you only did 5 interviews, people would say you don't have enough data. If you did about 30 interviews, people would believe that you had achieved saturation. But really it's about, did you achieve saturation, and what's the trustworthiness and the reliability of your data? So that's when sort of internal validity comes into play, like capturing the ground truth, so to speak, of, you know, the thing that you're trying to measure. And so that will come into play in terms of techniques, how you talk to people, the kinds of questions that you ask. You know, you could interview 100 people, but if people look at your interview guide and your data and they don't feel that your data are reliable because, you know, you have very thin responses, you're asking people very leading questions and introducing terms to them, and it seems to have a lot of confirmation bias, then, you know, you would be suffering from low reliability, which is more about internal validity. Is that your question? Okay. So really quickly, quality research similarly in qualitative data, a principle called Emergent Design, where you should, and it's a best practice, to allow your questions to evolve as you go. That means in terms of both your interview questions, your focus group discussion, your observation guide, but like the core of the research question that you're asking. The way that you understand the issue should evolve as you go. That is fine and encouraged, because that means that you're actually learning from your data, which is part of the point. It can lead to bias, and that is, I mean, again, I think you need to think about, kind of back to the carburetor example. If bias means that getting information from the stakeholders whose perspective you're trying to understand and incorporating that into your thinking, then that's good, because that means you're actually getting the information that you need and helping to shift the frame to reflect the stakeholders' perceptions. There certainly can be confirmation bias, which is bad. So that's one of the reasons that when you get into interviewing and get in the field, people encourage you to look for negative cases early. So that's just like a function of being humans. We'll seek confirmation or early opinions. So if you interview 5 people and they all tell you that the telework system is horrible, you seek out a person who says something different, because that'll help to round out the way that you're thinking about the problem early on. So it's not to say your results should you shouldn't let your early results inform your final conclusions, but you know, if you start talking to people about the telework program and they tell you, well, really the issue is transportation, you shouldn't just be talking about the telework system and like the way we do our forms. It's really a transportation problem, and you haven't thought about that initially. It's good and a best practice to incorporate that into the way that you go about the rest of your data collection. Does that? Okay. Sure. Yeah, That and also, so sorry, the question was in confirmation bias. So confirmation bias can be in terms of the questions that you ask and the responses, sort of people playing off of your questions to them and that leading to confirmation of the way that you ask the question, sort of like introducing terms. But it's also just your people and you start to get an idea of what the answer is, so to understand what stakeholders think about this data product. And you interview 4 people and they start to tell you similar themes. Don't let that convince you that that's what everyone thinks, because there's a much bigger picture, and there will always be a much bigger picture than just what the early people tell you. For instance, if there's a dimension of a problem that you hadn't considered previously, it's a practice to then incorporate that dimension of the problem in the way that you're thinking about it and what you ask future people about. And we'll get into how you construct questions in a way that doesn't lead them to a certain response. Okay, so really quickly, in terms of finding people to participate, random sampling. So sometimes you'll have a list, if you're really lucky, that you can use as a sort of sampling frame. If you have like a list of people who are registered in a program or a list of grantees or people who have access to site and you can contact them, you should use that. That's a good starting point. You can also use snowball sampling where you ask each person to refer you to others. In general, referrals can be great as part of a broader set of sampling strategies. And then also think about and gatekeepers. So for instance, a gatekeeper is someone who has access to a greater number of individuals who you really want access to. It can be a necessity where you won't be able to get to the other people unless you first speak to the gatekeeper, or it can just be a matter of convenience where it'll really help you and build your credibility. So for instance, if you wanted to interview physicians in the hospital system, they might not be able to speak with you until you first speak with the hospital CEO or a director of their division. Really similar in like military or hierarchical organizations as well. That's a really good person to find and build rapport with, and ideally even interact with yourself, because they tend to have a lot of important expertise. Okay, so we're going to go into in-depth interviewing now. Did anyone have any other questions online? Okay. Any questions before we dive in? Okay. So first, I want to highlight the really, really essential skills of any qualitative data collector. Empathy is a huge one. Anyone took UX design, you'll remember that you need to have empathy, and being able to understand a person's experience is very critical. The second is humility, and remembering that you don't know anything, and the person that you're interviewing or observing knows everything that you need to know. Being able to put yourself in that position of just being there to learn from them is extremely critical. Patience, because working with humans is inherently very frustrating. Just be prepared for that from the beginning. Reflexivity means that we'll get into this a little bit more, but you're the data collection instrument. This is another thing that makes some hardcore quant people very uncomfortable. You inherently influence the process, and being aware of how you influence the process is very important. Comfort silence, listening without analyzing. By that I mean when you're in a conversation with someone, or try to notice that you're either thinking about what they're saying or thinking about what you're going to say or thinking about the situation, but being able to truly just purely listen and hear what a person is saying and have no reaction or analysis to it at all is really important in helping you to get the best out of your qualitative data collection. And then comfort with silence. I say this a lot, just like wait people out. It's very important. Also makes people uncomfortable. But they'll talk if you just wait long enough. And, finally, something that it took me a long time to be good at is using adjectives, especially in observation and in analysis, an excruciating amount of detail to describe people and situations is very important, very tricky. So, and we will practice this, but in an example, so if you to observe observing this meeting even, if you're observing a meeting to understand like how a process works, if you're even doing like a usability assessment and observing how someone interacts with a digital product, then that's fine, but a lot of times you don't, and really all that you have is your ability to write down exactly what's happening. Being able to notice everything and then capture it in writing is like the crux of that form of data collection. So, for instance, saying, the person, clicked and completed this thing versus saying, entire paragraph, like exactly how much time they hesitated before they clicked something. Did they let a Post-it that was like to the right of their desk that told them, which drop down to select before clicking that? So as much detail as you can capture, it really relies on your ability to just like describe the pivot. This is something where if you're on WebEx, you will need to contact your partners. And then we will pairs in the room, we'll figure that out. We'll do like a baseline exercise to see how comfortable you are with interviewing. So this is really just about like cold exercise to get information from someone verbally. How do you go about doing that? Don't think too hard about it. These will come back to this after you learn some more concrete skills. I want you guys to take 5 minutes each and learn from your partner grocery shopping, how they do grocery shopping, how they make decisions about it. And then I'll let you guys know when it's been 5 minutes and you can switch, and then we'll come back and talk about it a little bit. Okay, so person one, wrap up, and then switch off to your partner. Okay, another minute and wrap up. Okay. Shut up. That's okay. So, okay, let's hear how did that go? Share how that was like. Things to think about. Yeah. Let's, in the interest of not being hypocrites, let me ask you another question.
Yeah, it went well. The challenge for me was it's hard to get into a conversation. That leads down to leading interviewee into certain questions. I just, now that I'm thinking about it, I know that I asked follow-up questions that maybe were leading questions, so that's a challenge, I think.
Yeah, you hit on like a lot of the really key challenges, is how to make it not a casual conversation, how to ask open-ended questions, how to not lead into sort of way that you think about something and put that to the questions that you're asking. Do you guys?
No. Oh. No, that was the biggest thing for me. I definitely agree with leading the questions and it turning into a discussion more than actual and you. And for me, the difficult part was it was a lot. I hadn't thought about what type of questions to ask or try to keep open-ended. So the person almost turned into leading my questions, and that's where I know getting into the biased area without thought.
Yep. You guys are really active about your interviewing skills, so that's awesome. I think that people online were sharing the same thing. Conversation was difficult to avoid getting personal, and enough information out of one question. So yeah, that's what we're going to talk about now, so that's great. Okay, anything else before we get good at interviewing? Actually, can I just ask, like, feel free to chime in on the chat and in the room. Raise your hand if you've ever done an in-depth interview, if you've ever conducted one. Okay. Have you ever been interviewed as a research interview? Like as a user feedback interview? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. That's interesting. I wonder if they're better at it. Might be. Okay, great. So now we'll dive into building up some of those that you guys mentioned having trouble with. So the first thing that I want to point out that I have always found really useful is what an in-depth interview is. Think about what it's not. So it's not a casual conversation, and it's not a survey. Really helpful things to keep in mind. As a lot of you guys pointed out, casual conversation is something that we have all the time, all day. So it's really easy to fall into that pattern unless you remind yourself, this is a totally different thing. It does not follow the rules of a casual conversation. Casual conversation, when someone says something, you want to respond. You want to acknowledge, say what you think about it. Talk experience you had. This is not that. Those are things you should not do. Similarly, it's not a survey. You're not there. So if you didn't answer, then you win the day. It's also not a survey. So it's not a list of questions that you're going to ask everyone in exactly the same way in order. This is that, unlike a survey, is flexible and fluid and should evolve as the interview progresses. The other thing to keep in mind is that the basis of in-depth interviewing is that everyone is an expert. In general, in life, as an expert at something. It can be something as simple as how they do their grocery shopping for their household. Because that's what they do all the time. They know exactly how they do it and why, and they have expertise. And we are all experts in how we live our lives on a day-to-day basis. So when you come in to interview someone, you're interviewing them as an expert in whatever you want to talk to them about, and you are there to learn from them. That kind of dictates how the rest of the interaction progresses. So one quick note on that is that because we're here for our jobs, we're not always going to be interviewing people about something really commonplace. Sometimes people don't know that they're experts. We probably don't walk around thinking of ourselves as experts in grocery shopping, even though we are, if somebody's interested in it. So those people, it will sometimes feel weird to talk in a lot of detail about what you're asking them about. They'll be like, do you really want to know like exactly the process of how I choose which milk I'm buying? So demonstrating interest and asking them to explain things to you is really helpful. Conversely, if you're interviewing some of these highly technical professionals, people who know that they're experts, they're very good, they're not going to be as patient with you all the time. So you can't always sit there and just keep asking them open-ended questions, eternally and ask them, expect them to sort of dump out their soul. Some people are harder to interview, and it's disproportionately people who are kind of used to it and know that people want to know what they know. So with those people, it's really important to, we'll talk about some specific techniques, but to do due diligence and kind of come in with a baseline understanding of what they do, using their terms, showing that you're not totally, fresh off the street trying to start from scratch and that you're not there to waste their time. And lastly, remember that sometimes it will be like pulling teeth, and that's because not everyone is a good talker. You can get a good interview out of everyone, but sometimes it's harder than others. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what the question was. What kind of guidance can you give people without biasing the interview? And that's exactly what we're going to talk about now. So we'll go through a very, hopefully practical, step-by-step guide of exactly how this process works. Okay, so what to do before the interview? So let's just say you found someone with the expertise that you need through the different sampling techniques that we've talked about. So the first thing to remember is that they are doing you a favor. They don't need to be interviewed. You need to interview them. So work around their schedule and travel to them if at all possible, not only for convenience, but because being in their environment will give you data in and of itself. So try to go to them if at all possible. Like if you can do a video chat instead of a phone conversation, that's better because that's more data. How to prepare in terms of a guide, topics, the questions that you want to cover, what kind of background information to look into. Important thing right before the interview is to focus on the task. Going to that recommendation and that skill of listening without analyzing, it's very difficult to do that if you've just come from a different task. If your mind is racing about something else, to really sit there and listen to someone. So block out at least 10 minutes before the interview to get your head in the game, for lack of a better term. So we'll also talk a little bit about the logistics, but always remember if you need to record an interview, have a recorder, have a backup recorder, have batteries, or a phone charger, however, notes, pen, paper, tablet that you need with you. And because we all interview in different environments, just putting a plug for thinking about safety, especially if you're interviewing yourself. Interview people all over the world for the work that we do, even here in places that we're not familiar with. So good safety tip is to just, if you're going by yourself, always let someone know where you're going. You should be back. So during the interview, the first thing that you need to do is set the stage for the interviewee. You know what an interview is and how you want it to go. And a really good rule of thumb to consider, remembering that this is not a casual conversation and that you are there to learn from them, is that the interview transcript should be about 90% them talking. If it miraculously gets to 95% and you just point them in the right direction a couple of times, then that is great too. But around 90% is the dream of people giving you very rich descriptions of exactly what you want to know about, and the only time you insert yourself is to just guide them in the right direction of what kind of information you need. But people don't know that that's how it's supposed to go, especially if, like most of us, we've never been interviewed before. It's like a casual conversation too, because that's what we're used to. So the first thing you need to do is sit down, reiterate to them why you want to learn from them. Hey, I'm really interested in learning from you what your experience has been like, participating in this program. Or I know that you're a user of tool, and we're really trying to improve it. So I'm really interested in hearing as much as possible from you today about what your experience has been like doing this. Tell them that you want them to tell you as much as possible. People want to be good interviewees. People want what to expect. It also helps to build rapport. Ask permission to record. A really important thing to think about is like, does it matter if you record it? What will be useful to you if you don't record it? What data will you have at the end? Would it be your notes? Is that enough? Or do you really have to have an audio recording? It's fair to ask about that and provide people with information about how the data will be used because that helps them to understand why they're sitting there talking to you for an hour about, the teleprogram. Okay, and finally, good thumb is use your guide. Don't let your guide use you. Don't ever feel like, oh, I skipped questions on my guide. I have to go back, even going to totally derail the conversation. Let them direct the way things go. If they've introduced a new topic that's extremely relevant and you never thought of it, but it's not your guide, that's great. Keep following that thread. It's okay to go back and make sure that you get them to talk about other topics, but don't feel like you have to ask everyone the same questions in order, because that is not the case. Any questions? Okay, so question types. So
Would it be easier to not get into the conversation if the interviewer, us, is not knowledgeable in the topic?
Yes. So, yes, you tell yourself at the beginning of the interview that you're not knowledgeable in the topic, even if you are. And that you know nothing about it. With the caveat, as I mentioned, of, it's advantageous if you can demonstrate some understanding, especially to people who, might be skeptical of your credibility. In general, yes, it's a lot easier if you know nothing about it, and you should always demonstrate to the interviewee that they know much more than you do, and you're there to learn from them. It will encourage them to provide much more detailed responses.
Also commented that people are not allowed by law to record the interviews. So do you have any any suggestions for if people can't record, how else can you record that information?
Yeah. So that's a really great point. Always follow the law. That supersedes the good interview. Able to record field notes, that is your primary source of data. And that just means every, note that you take during and after the interview. And we'll actually spend a minute on that because that's a really, really critical form of data that everyone should be doing, whether you can record or not. But yes, that fields are very important. Okay, so the next few slides I hope are a really helpful reference guide that you guys can just take with you. These are some really basic, effective question types. The book that I referenced at the bottom of the slide is called The Indepth Interview by Jim Spradley. I have a copy in the room if anyone wants to check it out. It's the Bible of in-depth interviewing. If you are are going to have to do many of these, I highly, highly recommend that you buy it and read it. You will keep it with you for the rest of your life. It's incredibly helpful. So some of the question types that you should have as staples in your tool belt, first are descriptive questions. So WebEx, if you ask a closed-ended question or closed question in your practice interview. Everybody? Okay. What is a closed question before? What's a closed or open-ended question? Yes, no, short answer, a number. Do you use that? How many times do you go? Do you like this or like that? Everyone will do that at the beginning. So train yourself to never ask a closed question. Even if you only change a few words, tell about how you might use a list when you're grocery shopping. So tell me about, describe, and explain are essential. essential. If you only ever ask, tell me about questions, you will do fine. So ensure that you're really practiced at formulating those questions. If you're writing an interview guide to review, if you're reviewing a contractor's interview guide, they should be questions that are open-ended and use some of these types. So tell me about that. Always ask people for more. What else about that? What else would you like to add? Because people will keep talking. Typical questions are really helpful. I start absolutely every interview that I do, unless it's with a really specialized audience, with tell me what a typical day is like for you. Really full context to understand who you're actually interviewing and set the context for everything else that they say. Great tour questions are meant to help people to explain a process. So you can sit there and guess what the process is with 100 closed questions. Do you do it like this? Well, is it after this, do you do X? Do you ever do X? Then you get the whole process. As well as if you just ask someone, I'm really interested in learning about how you program. Walk through the whole process. You don't have to start it off with a prompt like that. You can just say, tell me about the whole process of grocery shopping, or tell me about the whole process of applying, to participate in this program. And it encourages people to give you a really, really detailed response. And similarly, a good way to get data is through examples. So techniques that you can use to do that are to ask people, give me an example of when, whatever. Or give an example of the last time. If people have trouble recalling, asking about last time can be really helpful, or time in general. Similarly, tell me a time when it was different than that, to help kind of get at variation. Structural questions, I'll point out because we talked a bit about learning how people organize information cognitively. So if you want to know how people think of the different kinds of data that you put out, these are the questions that you should use. Think people group information mentally into clusters, and you can understand what those clusters are by generating lists. Ask them to tell you about all the kinds of all kinds of geography that they might be interested in, all the neighborhoods that they can think of, all of the places that they've ever looked for data for. Asking the same question multiple ways will almost always get you more information. People will tell you, I can't think of anything else about that, and if you ask the question a slightly different way, they will tell you more. Keep asking open-ended questions. Ask about the differences between different kinds of information. What's the difference between X and Y? Can you tell me you would do that versus when you would do this other thing you mentioned? On questions? No? Okay. Okay, so you've got a lot of questions, but you want to know more. So what is a probe, or what is the point of probing? Of probing? To find out more. The analogy that I actually used to Radhika the other day, and that I've always learned, is that, okay, so I'm not even totally conversant in this analogy, but Wile E. Coyote, everybody knows Wile E. Coyote, right? I think. And he apparently had like little pebbles and drop water on them, and they would turn into that huge boulder that's in there. Probing is that process. It's how to turn a little tiny nugget of what someone mentioned into a giant boulder, just asking them to talk more about it. Recognizing what to probe on is a skill that you'll build. For example, I heard in a lot of the grocery conversations terms like quality, selection, convenience. Those are things that you think that you know what they mean, but to the person you're talking to, they mean something totally different. Those are the kinds of terms when you hear them that you should think, I need to know more about what that means to that person. There's some techniques that you can use to do that. So the essentials are basically to not do anything at all, to just nod or say, okay. Tell me more about that is a really essential one. Similar to tell me out, you can just say, tell me more about that all the time and you'll be fine. The echo probe is sort of just to repeat back what the person has said to you and they'll keep talking. So there's some other probes that you can use to sort of get at the relationships between different terms that people have mentioned. I mentioned the divergence example to sort of ask people for an example of something that was a little bit different, to be mentioning a lot of patterns. Of these is that you get out of the way. So ask a few open-ended questions at the beginning and get people on the right track, and then just keep probing on what they've said. Generate really, really high-quality data, because you're not really inserting yourself into it at all. It's really just the information that they have in their head, and that's ideal. The times that you really want to redirect them, or if they're getting completely off topic, or if you want to make sure that you introduce a topic for them to talk about. So we are going to take a really quick break because we've been sitting for a while, and then we're going to go into the interviewing practice exercise, which will take about 45 minutes. So everybody, if we can make like a 5-minute, in air quotes, break, a little more than 5 minutes, then we'll dive into actually practicing all of this. So we're going to start again, and people are still filtering back in, which is fine. I wanted to point out 2 things that were mentioned during the break in the room. One is that I have mentioned a couple times the UX, UI course that was taught through the Commerce Data Academy. So we had a course that was on user experience and user interface, UX, UI design, or UX design? Yeah, UX design. So I referenced that a couple of times, and I think everything is archived, so you can check that course out. It has a lot of alignment with this one in terms of how you would apply different kinds of interviewing techniques to design something. And the other question was, do publications, like if you were to look at academic journals with qualitative research published, would they ask to include or review the interview guides? And the answer was yes, definitely. The very high quality journals that publish qualitative research ask to see your interview guide and may either offer or ask you to publish it as an appendix, and it's very commonplace for people to publish an example of their questions in the methods section. So that's another good thing to check out, just for some best practices and examples of how people ask questions about the topics that you're interested in. And then really quickly, I realized that I skipped a slide, which is actually the only slide that I have in here that has an example from an actual interview transcript. If anyone is interested, I can definitely share more. For people who are back, I want to just pause for a minute and ask you to read this to yourself and see what you notice about how this transcript went. This is an excerpt from an interview. I is interviewer and P is participant, so that's the person being interviewed. Just take it and read that over. About this excerpt. Feel free online, chat us what you notice. What look at sort of the question types and the kind of responses that they're giving. What do you notice?
One person online said that they asked the same question in really different ways.
Yeah, exactly. So that's definitely one thing here, is that you are asked the same question, I think, 3 different times in slightly different ways. And first response is pretty in, and as you continue to go, the participant sort of says, no, that's it. Yes, again, and more to say. So, one of how people will continue to talk, you just give them more opportunities. So, there's also some examples where the interviewer could have asked shorter questions. For instance, mine could have just been, tell me about healthy eating. Probably been a cleaner question. They've given a longer response to that. Okay, so hopefully everyone is back now. And we are going to put all of this together and try out interviewing each other again. So maybe you guys a similar topic to what you did in your sort of baseline interview. The challenge is you're working to design guidelines for helping supermarkets to increase sales of healthy foods. So I want us to interview each other about your experience as supermarket consumers. So the sort of big issue or goal that you're working on is you're trying to design guidelines that supermarkets can undertake. Structural changes, marketing promotions, digital, anything that a supermarket could do to increase the sales of their healthy foods. And you have the opportunity to interview people who shop at supermarkets to learn more about how they could go about doing that. So there's going to be a few different parts to this. The first part is that I want you guys to talk with each other and come up with 5 in-depth interview questions. So these are specific questions that you would put in your interview guide. Use a combination of descriptive and structural questions. You can use your crib sheet from the slides. So tell me more about, walk me through the process of, tell me about all the foods you can think of that are X. So use a different combination of those questions and of the probes that we came up with, that we talked about. Try to come up with 5, and then we'll test those out. So take less than 10 minutes. Why don't you guys start with about 5 minutes, talk with each other, and try to come up with 5 questions that you want to ask. Okay, sorry, I'm going to try to explain this better. So I'll lay out the whole thing for you. So we're going to first develop the questions. People in the room, feel free to all work together if you're welcome to do that. And people on the WebEx, totally up to you if you want to do this individually or on the phone. We're going to talk to each other about the questions and give feedback really quickly. And then we'll actually spend 10 to 15 minutes each interviewing each other, probably 10 minutes each, test out those questions, use the questions and the probes that we've learned, and then we'll talk about what worked and how that compares to what you tried earlier. So the first part, before we give each other feedback, is just going to be to come up with those in-depth interview questions and write them down if you can. Any questions on that process? Okay. So please chat us your questions. But do people in the room want to start off by just reading out some of the questions you guys came up with?
So we just start with walk me through your week of eating. A typical trip to the supermarket like, walk me through that. Suggestions for how we can increase health food sales. Layout of your perfect supermarket. And dislike the most about going to the supermarket. And all factors that influence the food you buy. Something?
Yeah, so those are great. I think you guys did a really good job of shifting to descriptive questions. One that I wanted to point out is even asking someone what layout of your supermarket, or describe to me what the supermarket or grocery store or whatever you call it is like, is really important. And, applies to everything, because, we walk into an environment, we experience it totally differently from someone else, and that has a lot of data, even in that, how they describe an environment to you, because you can go in observation and triangulate and say, wow, so this is, the person describes this display as being the most prominent, but that's not at all how I would see it. So that's a great question to ask.
Some questions online that people came up with were tell me about a time when you were really happy about a healthy food option that you purchased. What are the benefits of eating healthy? How would buying healthier foods impact your food budget? And what is an example of a purchase that made to a healthy lifestyle?
There are some good structural questions too, in terms of give me an example or tell me about different things. Getting examples is really good. I encourage everyone to start with the most general, most open-ended question possible. So go to the rule of thumb of interview is going to go how you explain it to a person. If you really set the stage for them doing most of the talking and being really descriptive to you, then they will do that. Start off with a closed question or a really specific question. You're going to send them down that path. So start off with a question like, tell me about grocery shopping, or tell me about what you eat in a week. At a typical day for you, and then working in based on what they say will go a long way, because the earlier questions are going to set the stage for the whole interview. You mess up down the line and ask a closed question, and do okay if you've set the stage from the very beginning by asking very general questions that encourage them to provide lots of information. The thing that I want to mention, these are really great questions, but notice in your questions where you inserted a term. You might be assuming that you and your interviewee have the same definition of that term. It could be healthy, it could be affordable, quality, budget even. We all have different definitions of those terms, so it's much better if they say the term first and you can understand what it means. Any questions? Okay, great. So now we're actually going to test this out. So I want you guys at least 10 minutes each. And before we get into this, did people in the practice round feel like you had trouble keeping your participant talking? Yes. Okay. So this is going to be in part an exercise in using these questions, but partially, remember, you want 90% of the talking to be the person you're interviewing. So set the stage for that. I want you guys to start off with your interview spiel, why you want to interview them, what you're interested in learning from them, and then start off with a really open-ended question, and then get into the probing and the questions that you've developed. Think about how that goes. Anything while you're interviewing. Only think about what they're saying. So we'll start with that, and then we will come back together and talk about how that went. I'll let you guys know when you should switch off partners. So, yeah, go for it. So I'm going to interrupt the interviews for a minute. New rule, no new questions. You're only allowed to probe on what the person has said. So use your script sheet if you need to. You can nod. You can say, mm-hmm. Tell me more about that. You mentioned X. Can you tell me more about that? Only probing, no new questions, and see how that goes. You guys have 5 more minutes. Up, and as soon as you get to a breaking point, switch over. So switch who's interviewing. And if you're on the phone or on WebEx, you can take, and whoever is the third person can take notes to provide feedback. New rule applies to the current interviewer. You're only allowed to probe, no questions. Only probe on what the person says. No mm-hmm, nod, or on something specific that they've said. Okay, to wrap up. Thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs halfway. Awesome. Okay. So, yeah, tell me how that went. What did you guys think? What was the experience like?
This is a great way to get people to talk. If you just and look at them. That's a pretty good tip. You had to transition and only ask the probing questions because you really had to did you take good enough notes to go back immediately and then grab a decent question? So kind of focusing on taking really clear notes.
Examples. Silence, definitely helpful. Note-taking is also helpful if you struggle with silence or if you feel awkward waiting for someone to talk. Taking really good notes will kind of keep you a little bit behind. So finishing your note-taking, it kind of gives the other person a little bit more time to think, so that's helpful as well for just forcing yourself to wait to ask another question.
It's unique. It takes a while to get used to. It's not the way I'm used to talking to people, like in a conversation,
Yep.
but it is effective.
Silence is a great listening tool, and it was difficult for me to actually form more questions without going somewhere else. So that was the curve. I learned to take better notes.
Cool. Yeah, those are all really good points. The first few times that you do an in-depth interview, it will suck, and you will inevitably, no matter how much of, an extraordinary interviewer you end up being, it takes a while to adjust to those things, that it's not a normal conversation. You really have to shift the way you think about interacting with someone. Probing gets easier too. So what did you guys think about, including people online, keep chatting us, but how questions that you developed on paper were effective, and how did you find that they changed at all when you actually said them in an interview?
Were effective because the questions we developed before were so broad, they would work without any person. As station starters, because it opens people up, and especially shopping is something everyone does, so it's fairly easy to get a conversation rolling.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm looking at one of the comments from online that's kind of similar. Having knowledge of the topic does have a positive note, such as probing is easier when you know which keywords you can say to keep the interviewee talking. Because I felt confident with my questions, but after they were answered, I was like, oh shoot, now what? That's very, very accurate. So, so these are all great points. Listening, so having done that exercise, it makes more sense to say just hardcore listening without analyzing. You won't have to rely on your notes as much. Your ears will perk up when you hear a word like selection or quality or value. And all you have to do is write that down in your notes and then say, you mentioned value. Can you tell me more about that? So kind of that algorithm of a sentence in your head. If you mentioned X, can you tell me more about that? And all you have to do is plug in any word That's like it has meaning to the person that you're talking to. And it's a great point that, knowing a little bit about the domain helps because you recognize words, but it doesn't have to be the case. It can be words you've never heard before. It can be like quality that we all use all the time, but you suspect it might mean something different. Honestly, even if it doesn't mean something different, it will keep the person talking, and that's usually a good thing. You can do to keep them talking, introducing ideas is a good thing. What else did you find you did better this time than you did the first practice round?
Better just the structure of questions is key. I mean, the openness of it was weird for me. Found myself like wanting to scratch that itch of getting to a conversation a little bit, so that that's something I guess comes with this and a lot of just discipline of like, notice, let them continue rambling about whatever, even if it's something that they could say something that's inherently really interesting. I guess in that sense, you would want to follow up with a relevant to the actual interview, but otherwise, no. So. Yeah,
that's a good point. So in the category of more squishy techniques, I always try to think of a really an in-depth interview as like a very low-key experience. Like I'm not going in there to say anything. I'm kind of going in there to just chill out and let them talk to me. And emptying your mind of everything else is a really big part of that. So just remembering, you don't need to have any reactions. You don't need to relate to anything. You just need to hear what they're saying and think of it as they have a ton of information in their brain that you need to extract from them. So they're there to just dump it all out onto a recorder or onto a page. But it definitely takes some practice. It's a really good point. And what was it like to keep people talking for 10 minutes?
Talking I find difficult because it's really, I have it of asking blunt and short or closed questions, not open-ended. So I try to change my perspective to try to keep asking the open-ended questions, which is difficult.
Yeah. So again, I think that's a really good practice of, how the early tone of a conversation can set the stage. One of the things that I almost always do is I start off with sort of my opening, here's what we're here to talk about, and I ask every single person I interview, tell me a little bit about yourself, and just let people say whatever they want to say. There will always be important contextual information in that, but it gets them comfortable talking, which not everyone is. And then I always follow that up with, okay, great, so now can you tell me what a typical day is like for you? You could, in this case, follow that up with, great, and so how does food or eating fit a typical day? If you wanted to learn more about what that's like. Just to build that series of really basic, open-ended questions can be really helpful. And that will give you a volume of information to probe on, but then you can follow that up with some more specific questions. People have, after that exercise, things that you're still unclear on or wanted to talk about more? Practice, but I think you guys did great. Okay, so there's a couple more things in the kind of tips category. Hopefully you've learned from that exercise that, as I mentioned earlier, you are the data collection instrument. When you're interviewing someone, when you're observing, when you're facilitating a focus group, unlike in a survey where the instrument is the piece of paper and you should just not interfere interfere with the paper at all, because that's what you're trying to get information from. You are inherently the instrument collecting information. So that means be aware of what you're saying and doing and who you are, what you look like, influences the data, but it also means you have to find what works for you, and everyone is different. So, for instance, I always take really, really detailed notes when I interview. I have very skilled interviews who always go paperless. They will never walk into an interview with a piece of paper. They feel it interferes with rapport. They don't listen as well when they're taking notes, and they would never do that. I feel exactly the opposite. So try both out and see what works for you. Yeah, they have to record it. So yeah, that's a great point. So the way that you can record interview data are through an audio or a video recording, through field notes taken in person, and through your field notes taken after the fact. 3 different types. There are people who only, for instance, a lot of ethnographers don't really take notes while they're sitting with someone, but they write extremely detailed field notes after they walk away from the person. So that's an approach you can take as well. I personally find that it's really helpful to take notes during the conversation. Thing is how you probe. So you're better at probing. People choose to sort of follow a thread the way that it happens naturally. So if someone talks to you for a couple minutes, they give you a really long answer, and 10 things that you want to probe on. Some people will always just probe on the last thing they said and just kind of follow that path as far as it goes. I like to start from the beginning and say, okay, like, let's go back. You know, you mentioned this. I want to learn more about that. So that's something else that you can try different ways. And something that was brought up in that previous conversation, and that we talk about a lot in qualitative data collection and user experience design, is how to deal with asking why. So, quick poll. In your practice, did you ever ask why? Why do you do that? Or tell me why. So there is some debate on this. I advise you to never ask why. You always want to know why, like you said, indirectly, and you want to understand what motivates people, how they got to an outcome. But asking why can be confrontational. It can make people feel a little bit defensive, and you're not always going to get the right information. They'll give you a sort of glib answer or like a kind of answer, but they won't give you the full picture. Similarly, as you guys know, don't ask closed questions, don't introduce terms, and don't insert your opinion. Okay, really quickly. That question. So, what you like someone says something, you say, yeah, I know what you mean. Or
like my partner was saying, like he buys a certain product, and I'm like, oh, our way of doing it because you save time and money by doing it a certain way. Go with them.
I was, I think, especially, you know, if you label something as smart or want to kind of have the effect of validating or not, I would avoid doing that. It changes the dynamic a little bit. You kind of want to keep your opinion and how it relates to what you think out of it altogether. So I think it's safer to just say, yep, I understand. I totally know what you mean. That just kind of affirms with your opinion.
Cool.
So really quickly, and then we'll move on to a couple of the final topics. Always remember to ask people for follow-up referrals. You should assume that you want to talk to that person again. And if you don't end up doing that, it's really important to keep the door open and to ask who else they know that you should be talking to. Similarly, to get back to the topic of field notes, this is really important for the person who asked about what to do if you can't record. So your field notes are then your only data, memory, and how you translate them onto paper. So a practice that you should always be in is to write field notes immediately or as soon as possible after you do an interview or after any kind of qualitative data collection. So one tip that I would give you is if you have to run off to something else, don't have time, just like pick up your phone and record a voice note. Just talk through everything that happened. Talk through the scene, describe what the room was like, what the person was like, how the conversation went, what you think was really important from that interview, what else you want to ask them. Just do a quick brain dump before you forget. You can come back to that audio file later and type it out or write it out. As soon as possible, to document all of those data points on paper. If you are not able to record, some people try to reconstruct the conversation from memory. That's incredibly hard to do, but if there are snippets of the conversation that you really want to capture, try to get those down on paper or on audio as soon as possible. The list here in the slides is an example of the kinds of things that you want to include in your expanded field notes. So what your data looks like at the end of the day, if you have the ability to get a written transcript from your audio file, you'll have a transcript and you'll have your expanded field notes. And these can be incredibly tedious, mind-numbingly tedious to do, but really important because information is data. Like I found that person, what the room looked like, how you that you influence the interview process. If someone wanted to pick up this transcript later on and understand what's in it, they need that information. So it's really important to get that information out of your brain onto paper as soon as possible. And include a map. Maps are good. Always draw a sketch of where you are, if that's wise. We're going to move on to our method. Does anyone have questions on anything before that? Okay. So we're going to move on to focus groups. I think we're a little bit behind, so we might skip one of these exercises. But have you ever, people on the webinar or in the room, have you guys ever been in a focus group? You have? What kind of focus group was it? Transportation policy focus group. That's like a technical expert panel kind of thing? Okay, cool. So a focus group, so do you want to, like, radio station, what kind of music people liked? That's a really good example. Anyone on webinar have anything to say about that?
One person was on yellowpages.com when they were first launching. Focus group for yellowpages.com.
Cool. So something that we kind of hear about a lot because they've been adopted by market research. Adopted/co-opted a little bit by market research. So a focus group is a facilitated discussion among individuals. So moderator introduces some topics for discussion with maybe 3 to 4 or more people. And the data from a focus group come from the interaction between individuals. So really important to note that a focus group is not a group interview. It's getting 6 people in a room and asking each of them to answer the same questions. That's a separate method. There are sometimes it's like culturally appropriate or only logistically possible to do a group interview. That's fine. The focus is a different thing. And really the point is that you want to get data about consensus, how they'll talk to each other about a topic, whether or not they agree and where they disagree. To sort of triangulate and see, okay, well, this is how people talk about it in a private one-on-one interview, but when people are together, maybe there's a different politic to it, or there's a different way that people share information. So that's the data. It really relies on the interaction between individuals. So on that, you can use a lot of the same techniques as you did in an interview. You can use the same question types, the same probe types. You can group people the same way. You can ask the same, answer the same kinds of general questions. But where we really want to shift to focus on the group interaction and what can you learn from having people talk to each other. So similarly to an interview, you want to introduce a topic and encourage people to interact and discuss with each other. The ideal size for a focus group is 4 to 8 people. You can do larger, but people will not participate. Once you get above 6 or more people, it's really hard for people to meaningfully interact with each other, all of them. And also realize that when you do one focus group, your sample size is 1. Your N is 1 focus group. It's not 5 or 6 people. So if you need to get multiple data points from focus groups, you'll need to conduct multiple different groups. And remember that your role is to facilitate as the person in charge. You help people to break in. If someone is being really silent, you can kind of nudge them and ask them what they think. And your job is really to get the participants talking to each other. So this is like absolutely the most quick and dirty explanation of focus groups ever, since I think we did it in under 2 minutes. But with that, I want to give you guys just a few minutes to practice doing that. So for the people on webinar, if you guys can jump back on the phone, this will be a really, really small focus group group, and that's okay. But what I want you guys to do here is focus on exactly the same topic that we were using before. Design guidelines to make supermarkets better, more healthy foods. But now I want you to shift the way that you facilitate, the way that you ask questions, and really help people to interact with one another, and questions that really focus on agreement, consensus, disagreement, help people to kind of have a conversation with each other. So we'll do that for just a few minutes. The people on the phone, if you guys can just select a moderator and focus on that person asking questions to the others, then we'll do a quick debrief afterwards. Questions on that? Okay, great, go for it. So for folks on the webinar, if you guys can wrap up. And let's talk a little bit about how that went. So we had one focus group here in the room, active. So I might turn it over to someone else to see if they can just give a readout on what that was like. But if people on WebEx, please chat us, you know, we learned and how that went.
So I was the moderator, and it went well. It was a bit awkward starting, getting the conversation rolling, but once it was going, it was actually much easier to just manage the dynamic giving input than to pull information out of a single interviewee. So in a sense, it was more, I think the amount of data that was produced was greater, and I think maybe the quality was even higher in that sense.
That you want to add?
It's definitely easier to have interaction and like kind of fill those gaps. Other people will say something that makes you think of something as well, so it's
great. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think that is like a great point, like in the beginning, like for the awkward part to have like you said, like ask like a question for everyone to kind of like get warmed up to, you know, their questions. So yeah, that definitely would help, like to have an icebreaker or, you know, asking questions.
Yeah, great point. Icebreakers are really helpful. So again, just to reiterate, I would encourage you guys when you moderate focus groups to, how you establish sort of why you're there and what you want to hear from everyone. Just an icebreaker that's very sort of friendly, low pressure, what's your favorite food kind of question that's on topic, but easy for everyone to answer, and give everyone a chance to say a few words about that to establish the expectation that everyone will speak, and like let people just have their voices heard once, go a long way to get even participation throughout the rest group and going into questions that are sort of posed generally to the group. So there's one response from WebEx that says, we chose a focus group of healthy parents. These would be the ones that have a challenge of eating healthy and having the kids eat healthy. Obviously, parents and kids have different views of what they prefer to eat, even if it's healthy. That's a great example, and a good use of a focus group because people can relate to each other about being parents and have kids and having to try to feed their kids healthy food. So that's an experience that people can kind of compare and contrast, and you can get a lot of information that way. Other thing I want to highlight is the focus group here kind of elicited ideas, and that can be a really, really good thing to do in a focus group. In an interview, people run out of ideas pretty quickly. If you say, brainstorm ideas of how the supermarket could change, people will have a few ideas, but it's just any other brainstorming session when you have more people to bounce ideas off of, and more kind of ideas popping up. That's a better environment for people to brainstorm different alternatives. So that's a good focus group as well. Okay, great. From WebEx that I want to point out. So in the last 10 minutes, I also just want to say in the references at the end on the last slide, you'll see that there's a whole book about focus groups. It's a great reference. This was like a very, very cursory overview of what a focus group is and how it's different from an interview. But there's obviously, much more to it than that. And please that resource and reference. And if you would like to talk through any more information, definitely feel free to contact me, and I can point you towards some more information. Okay, so I think we'll just go really quickly over observation, and probably won't have time to get to the exercise, but I would encourage you to do that offline because it's really good practice. So the second kind of bucket of qualitative data activities was observing people. So we've gone over a few different ways to talk to people, and now we're talking about observing people can help you to triangulate your data. So when you want to use this is when you're talking to people about behavior, and they can report to you. So for instance, they can tell you what health foods they buy, but that might diverge from what they actually buy. So in observing, whether at a supermarket or somewhere else, you can actually see actual behavior rather than just reported behavior. And the differences between those two things is really important data. Use this to examine work processes, norms. If you were to observe, show someone for a day, if you were to observe a key meeting and see how people interact with one another, to learn how people use a tool. Usability assessments are a really basic kind of direct observation where you just watch someone interact with your online product or app, so you can actually see how they use it and how people actually interact with it in practice. Provides really useful feedback as well. There are many, many types of observation. Observation is like usability assessment, where you just watch them do the thing, do the task, or complete something, complete an activity, and you don't interfere. Participant observation is a whole method that comes out of anthropology that focuses on you participating in an activity. So we went to someone's house and we're celebrating a holiday with them. You were doing that as data collection. That would be participant observation, because you're actually participating in the activity, learning what it means to people, and being part of it while observing. That's participant observation. Narrated is something that is an entire field in and of itself. Things like cognitive task analysis, where if you want to understand how an expert does a really complicated mental task, you would use a method called cognitive task analysis, and there's a reference to that, and if anyone would like more information, happy to follow up. So some technical considerations. I apologize, I think the formatting is a little bit messed up on this slide, so I'm not sure if you can read, but to interviewing, you want to start as open-ended as possible. Don't box yourself into knowing what you need to know from observation. You should start going in an as open-ended way as possible, just observing and documenting everything that you see and everything that happens. Some task-based methods, as I mentioned earlier on, this is a kind of observation that's combined with other methods that helps you to get really structured qualitative data you can use to create things like, something could feed into a software program or a quantitative model. These are pretty specialized, and I think we might actually be considering having a course on one of these topics. So if it's of interest, that would be really helpful to know. Feel free to chime in. These are things methods you can use to understand how brains are organized, basically. Everybody thinks about geography in a different way. Boundaries of neighborhoods, for example, are extremely fluid, and they are different to different stakeholders. So if you're trying to create different geographies and you want them to be meaningful, these are the methods that you could use to understand what are meaningful units to people, among many, many other things, including social network analysis, which has kind of seen a resurgence because of social media. But this is just a way to understand how people are connected with one another and how that influences work and outcomes and processes. So we won't have time for this, but I really encourage you guys to do this. If you do this activity and want to talk or would like any feedback on your notes, please feel free to reach out, send them to me. So what I encourage you guys to do is to take 5 minutes and just click on this link and watch this video, which is like kind of comical and hopefully not overly political. It's from the Senate floor where they are having a discussion. And the exercise that I think is really valuable to do is take a notebook, paper, and write down everything that you see and observe. Consider things like the setting and the participants practice that skill of just using adjectives to the point that it feels absolutely ridiculous. So describe those things, how the people interact with each other. What is their tone? What kinds of terms do they use? What things do they all seem to, have the same assumptions about rules that they're talking about or that they're implying? Try to distinguish between what is concretely observably there and what's something that you're inferring about or the reflections that you're making about it. And just try to be as descriptive as possible. So doing that is called a scripting observation. It's basically write everything. It's a very important exercise to start off with that can inform the work that you do down the line. So it's basically start by capturing everything that you possibly can. And it's a challenging exercise to document things as they're happening. So yeah, I encourage you to take that practice and feel free to reach out if you'd like any feedback or have any questions. So just with the last few minutes, I want to mention a couple of logistical constraints and considerations. The one that I haven't mentioned the whole afternoon is institutional review boards, and the Paperwork Reduction Act. So these constraints that affect us feds in different ways. Also, laws that govern data and data collection within your office. Those are really important things to be aware of. Institutional review boards, these are things that you should ask about. If you're ever going to be in the position of collecting data, you should make sure to investigate and work around these issues, or work within them rather. Some of us, never have to worry about IRBs as feds, but if you're working with a university or working with, with industry, they do. So those are things that you should be aware of. They typically just have to review your data collection protocols as they would with anything else. One important category to be aware of is that if someone's ever considered, quote, not research, you almost all of these rules except the Paperwork Reduction Act. So interviewing federal employees about their job is always not research, because that's something that's in the public interest. Other kinds of activities that are interviewing and collecting qualitative data, but they're not research. If you're not trying to produce general knowledge, it's not research, and that can be really helpful to keep in mind. And finally, if you do have audio files or text files or anything digital or hard copy, be really mindful and have a plan up front for how you're going to store everything, especially if you have, information about individuals participating or the locations where you collected data. Typical rule of thumb is, encrypted files, password protected, physically locked, and secured offices. But those are things that you should look into more information about. I think with that, we are just about out of time. As from the beginning, this is not a course on analysis, so we kind of skipped over this whole issue of what to actually do with the information. Again, if that's something that is of interest, please let us know, and we can, we are available to come to your bureaus and do workshops to work with your projects individually, and can, consider making that a course if people are interested. And also feel free to reach out to me for more guidance on where to look for more information. So the additional resources, I would really highly recommend that everyone check out. There's a bunch that's online that are shorter research articles that really talk about these methods and how to use them. And again, I would put in a plug for Spradley. The book, The Ethnographic Interview, is absolutely everything that you need to know about being an incredible interviewer. So does anyone have other questions or anything that they want to bring up before we conclude?
Okay, thank you everyone for attending the class today. Following the class, we will send out a post survey as well as the recording. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. Have a good day.